Up next, it's time to move past the epidermis into the dermis. So the dermis, obviously, deep to the epidermis. Epi means on top of, so it sits on the top of the dermis. Depending on how thick the skin is, the dermis can be anywhere from 0.5 millimeter to 3 millimeters thick. And the dermis itself is actually divided into 2 layers. The top layer is this bumpy layer, and it's called the papillary layer. And then the next layer is called the reticular layer. Papillary comes from the root papilla, which means nipple. So these are little nipple-shaped indentations or extensions that interweave with epidermal ridges in the epidermis created by this folding of the stratum spinosum and the stratum basalli. Papilla is a word that's going to come up actually several times in this course, so make sure you remember that one. Yeah, it means nipples. Anytime you see papillary, it's something nipple-shaped. Now, the reticular layer is not made of reticular tissue, okay? That's just confusing and annoying, I know, but there we are. It's just a network of different kinds of tissues and structures that make up this thicker layer of the dermis. So the dermal papillae, like we said, these are these little things here. Papillae is plural for papilla. Each of these little papillae actually also has a capillary. A capillary bed is where gas exchange actually happens. Notice that there weren't any blood vessels within the epidermis. So all of the nutrients to supply all of these cells in the epidermis has to be diffused through those cells. So it comes from these capillary beds in these papillae and then diffuses its way through these cells. The papillary layer itself is made of areolar connective tissue. You remember that's that really loosely organized connective tissue. Now, the reticular layer is this next layer, and you can see it's got just all kinds of stuff in there. So we're going to learn about all those things in the reticular layer. It is mostly dense, irregular connective tissue, and you remember that's the one with bundles of collagen fibers kind of going every which way. This reticular layer also contains the hair bulb and the hair follicle, where the hair grows from, the sebaceous glands that make oil, the merocrine sweat glands, which are the most common kinds of sweat glands in the armpit and the groin and a few other areas. It's also going to have apocrine sweat glands. It has tons and tons of sensory receptors. And here's a weird thing about your nervous system. See all these little shapes, all these different shapes of sensory receptors. These are each a different kind of sensory receptor. If you want to know their names, that's all in your textbook, but you don't have to learn it for this class. Each of these sensory receptors responds to a different type of stimulus. So there's a different receptor for heat, there's a different receptor for cold. There's one for pressure, there's one for vibrations, there's one for pain. Okay, those are all different sensations that have different receptors. And when you get to physiology class, you're going to do an experiment to show that in some parts of your body you have more touch receptors than in other parts of your body on the skin. So those receptors are also connected to nerve fibers or neurons, nerve cells. And then we also have lots and lots of blood vessels running through here. Actually, far more blood goes through the dermis than is required to support these tissues and even the tissues of the epidermis. That's because, remember, one of the functions of the skin is to help regulate body temperature. So when you are in a hot environment, your body can send more blood to the dermis, and a lot of that is then going to be lost to the environment to prevent you from overheating. All right, so let's talk for a moment about tattoos, because tattoos are kind of cool. They're permanent. The reason that they're permanent is that the dye is injected into the dermis, into the dermal layer. If the dye were injected into the epidermis, it wouldn't be permanent. It would slough off as these cells made their way up through the stratum corneum and then were rubbed off. Because the dermis is a permanent layer and doesn't get replaced, tattoos are permanent. Now, the reason the tattoos fade over time is that immune cells, phagocytes within the dermis, surround the dye granules and try to break them down. And usually they can't break them down, so they actually create a tiny little layer of scar tissue around the dye granule. And that's why tattoos fade and become less distinct. So there you go. That's why your tattoos are permanent. All right, now under the subcutaneous layer under the dermis is the subcutaneous layer. It's also called the hypodermis. Okay, so epidermis, hypodermis. A hypodermic needle is long enough to penetrate through the epidermis and the dermis into the subcutaneous layer, or the hypodermis. It's technically not part of the integumentary system, but it's also not part of anything else, so we talk about it here. It is made up of areolar connective tissue and adipose connective tissue. So it is a layer of padding that connects the dermis to the structures underneath it. And it's also called the superficial fascia, which is going to be important when we get to the muscles, where we have a deep fascia that we talk about. Okay, so in this next section, we're going to learn about the hairs, and then we're going to learn about all the glands in this layer. So stay tuned for that.